Good afternoon, everybody. Let me welcome you to this panel on multilateral governance architecture relating to space. And let me abuse my powers as moderator to quickly steal maybe 4 minutes to provide an overview of what the discussion is going to be before introducing the panelists to you. I just wanted to make 2 quick overview points before we get into the discussion in the panel. One is to contextualize the backdrop of the discussions that are taking place in relation to multilateral governance architecture in the last 5 years. 4 years ago, that is in 2014, the Montreal Declaration on Global Space Governance was adopted at the second Manfred Lachs International Conference on Global Space Governance, which was organized at the McGill University. This declaration states, and I'm quoting 2 lines from this declaration, quote, "The current global space governance system that was created in the 1960s and 1970s has not been comprehensively examined by the international community since its establishment. Numerous developments have occurred in the space sector. The time has come to assess the efficacy of the current regime of global space governance and to propose an appropriate global space governance system that addresses current and emerging concerns." Now, the Montreal Declaration then commissioned a study, which they called an international and interdisciplinary study, which was undertaken and which has culminated last year in the publication of a book edited by Ram Jakhu and Joseph Pelton called Global Space Governance. This is not purely in the realm of academics, because this is likely also to be discussed at the Unispace Plus 50 event in Vienna in June this year, including the recommendations that are contained in the book. So that's the broad backdrop of the discussion on global space governance as it stands today. Of course, what we mean by global space governance is this patchwork of governance which includes the UN at the very core, and the 5 UN treaties, but also many other non-binding instruments and other players that have emerged, the institutional structure of the CUPOS, the OOS, etc., both within and outside of the United Nations. We are also looking at some of the other non-binding instruments, the draft international code, the group of governmental experts, etc., which have already been discussed in some of the previous panels. Now, given this canvas, I think I should congratulate the organizers for having set up a brilliant panel, because I will very briefly introduce, without going into the details, in reverse order in which the speakers will be speaking. So we have Mr. Ian Christensen, who is with the Secure World Foundation, and who focuses specifically on issues of commercial space, satellite, and aviation markets. He's worked with space sector consulting firms, etc. And I guess we would look forward to hearing from him specifically about the commercial actors and their entry into the realm of outer space. We have also Ms. Friederike Schamper, who's the head of political affairs of the EU delegation to India, and who's worked earlier with the German Ministry of International Cooperation to perhaps get inputs into the regional developments in relation to global space governance. And last, but not the least, of course, we have 2 ambassadors, Ambassador Paul Meyer and Ambassador Rakesh Sood, who have actually been very involved in the negotiations in the Conference on Disarmament as well. So they would perhaps be able to give us the first-hand view of what is happening in the context of the CD and how that connects with developments in outer space governance and come in with the diplomatic view. So I think this would be the overall comprehensive viewing of global space governance as it stands today. With this, may I first call upon Ambassador Paul Meyer to address us. Thank you.
Yes, as this panel is entitled Multilateral Governance Architecture, I want to give you early on my principal observation, which is that such an architecture does indeed exist. It is structurally sound, but it could benefit from some preventative maintenance, and the occasional renovation project. We have in the Outer Space Treaty of 1967 a foundational treaty really of extraordinary importance. It represents in some ways the apogee of international cooperation on the governance of outer space. With over 100 states parties, the Outer Space Treaty enjoys wide support and provides a normative framework of deep and enduring significance. The treaty enshrines the principles that are fundamental to the preservation of outer space as an operating environment basically free of man-made hazards and threats. These core principles include the designation of outer space as a global commons, precluding any claims of sovereignty or national appropriation. And I would urge you to consider those core principles as constituting a very effective conflict prevention measure. You only have to recall how often territorial disputes have fueled conflicts and war here on Earth. The Outer Space Treaty has an explicit peaceful purposes orientation, one that is buttressed by specific prohibitions against the stationing of weapons of mass destruction and the militarization of celestial bodies. There's a strong emphasis on international cooperation, with the treaty affirming that the exploration and exploitation of outer space should be for the benefit and in the interest of all countries. The treaty stipulates that activities of all parties must be conducted in a manner that avoids harmful interference with the assets and operations of other actors. Provision is made for consultation and the possibility of reciprocal visits. Finally, the treaty celebrates the exploration of outer space as an enterprise of all humanity, with astronauts or cosmonauts or taikonauts, all to be considered as, in the language of the treaty, envoys of all mankind. In my view, the Outer Space Treaty was and remains a model of cooperative outer space diplomacy. Given the Outer Space Treaty's central place in the governance architecture for outer space, its cornerstone, if I can extend the metaphor, I was dismayed, frankly, by the lack of recognition and celebration of its 50th anniversary last year. In a period when we are told that the rivalry between major powers has been revived, it's a sad testimony that leading space powers seem inclined to play down and even ignore the cooperative spirit and the legal constraints set out in the Outer Space Treaty. The wider stakeholder community, including the private sector and civil society, must rouse itself to press for continued respect for the Outer Space Treaty-based regime and insist that their governments engage in responsible conduct in this crucial, if vulnerable, operating environment. Inflated threat assessments can all too readily be cited as justifications for provocative developments and escalatory actions in anticipation of what some proclaim will be the inevitable space conflict. As long recognized by the near universal support for the annual PEROS, the Prevention of an Arms Race in Outer Space resolution that is adopted in the UN General Assembly, the Outer Space Treaty regime is judged not to be sufficient in and of itself to achieve the prevention of an arms race in outer space. Additional measures to consolidate and reinforce that regime and make it more effective are required. Now, although this prescription is repeated frequently by the international community, it has not been followed up with the determination and purposefulness that it merits. There is, however, suitable material at hand to help reinforce the regime and insulate it from the vagaries of geopolitical tensions. And I'd like to briefly refer to 5 developments or potential initiatives which could contribute to enhancing international cooperation. First is to continue to look at building on the Outer Space Treaty. And the specific proposal in that regard would be to consider an optional protocol to that treaty on the non-weaponization of outer space. It has been frequently referred to that the treaty only provides a prohibition on weapons of mass destruction. An optional protocol, a supplementary arrangement, could allow for that to be extended to all weapons, and without running the risks of opening up the treaty itself to amendment. Second, we need to further develop the impressive achievement of 2013, when a very diverse UN group of governmental experts on transparency and confidence building measures in outer space achieved a consensus report that is and continues to be a very rich menu in terms of measures that could enhance the effectiveness of the existing regime. Third, we have just last week a significant contribution in terms of a further 9 guidelines from the long-term sustainability working group under COPUS agreed in Vienna, bringing up to, I think, 21 the number of guidelines now endorsed. Some of them very modest, but they all are imbued with this notion of collective responsibility and international cooperation. Fourth, the International Code of Conduct. Along the lines of that which the EU originated, but regretfully, in my estimation, seems also to have now abandoned. There is, however, considerable merit in reviving a text, obviously in light of the clear political direction received over the last years, that it be submitted ideally by a more representative group of states into the General Assembly and a multilateral process launched for its negotiation. And finally, as a fifth element, I think, though there's been scant reference to it, we have a new UN group of governmental experts exercise that has been launched, will be underway this year and next with a reporting deadline for the fall 2019 session of the UN General Assembly, and that specifically is directed at looking at elements of legally binding instruments that could be developed for the prevention of arms race in outer space. And I think that vehicle should be explored and in some ways represents a manner of circumventing the long-standing paralysis in the Conference on Disarmament by using the convening authority of the General Assembly to have a new process underway. And I think whatever one's sentiments are about the immediate prospects for new international instruments, I think it merits involvement as a vehicle for consultation and further exploration of the parameters for cooperation. So I think instead of the doomsday prophets and the armchair space warriors, we need re-engagement of a constituency of advocates for space peace who will uphold the cooperative security premise of the Outer Space Treaty and preserve its heritage. The blueprints are drawn up, the building materials are at hand, the skilled labor force is still available. We just need a prime contractor to initiate the refurbishment of our multilateral space architecture. For those who wish to secure peace and prosperity in outer space for future generations, the slogan is, "Why wait for spring? Do it now." I thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Meyer. May I request Ambassador Sood for his views now?
Thank you very much. And let me also congratulate Raji on this conference, having put together an extremely impressive agenda, and the conversations that we've been having since yesterday are evidence of the amount of interest and expertise on this subject in this room. I can actually address this topic in the form of 3 short questions. First, is there a global governance architecture? And I think Paul said yes. I would just qualify that by saying yes, but it is somewhat creaking and sort of coming apart at the seams. The second question is, do we need to preserve it or update it or strengthen it? And once again, the answer is a yes, we need to. And there are certain, steps which have been talked about. The third question is this process, does this process appear politically likely? And the answer to that is no. And I could sort of stop here if you want, and because this, in a sense, completes. But I agree with much of what was said, in the sense that, yes, there is a global governance architecture. I don't need to spell out the elements to a group like this. There are a number of multilateral treaties that have been negotiated, particularly during the 60s and 70s. In addition, there have been certain norms that have been practiced, like not interfering with each other's national technical means, and so on. And this together constitutes, in many ways, the existing global governance structures. However, as I said, a large part of it was put together in the 60s and 70s. And so clearly, it was a different time. Today, the number of players has grown. The number of space-related activities has grown hugely. And there is also the development of, or the integration, in a sense, of a host of other activities, the cyber-related activities, which also impinge on, in some ways, the outer space-related architectures. Also, early warning, electronic warfare, many of these things, which today come together and, in a sense, are not covered when the original architecture was designed in the 1960s and 70s. The dual-use nature of space technologies has become far more prevalent in our lives today than it was in the 60s and 70s. So while the basic fundamental principles of the 60s and 70s, namely that it is a common heritage of mankind and therefore is not subject to national appropriation, as it were, is something that those stand, but they are being challenged in terms of some of these new developments that are taking place. And this is why, in a sense, it is somewhat coming apart at the seams unless we are able to strengthen it and make sure that it addresses contemporary technologies and potential future developments. Now, how do you strengthen it? And here, I think Paul spelled out the possibilities, and in terms of the group of governmental experts and things like that, I am somewhat less optimistic because of the fact that ultimately the platform that was created to work on outer space, an outer space legal regime, namely the Conference on Disarmament in Geneva, remains paralyzed. And so therefore, whatever we do in terms of confidence building measures, transparency measures, they remain in a sense voluntary. That's why we can look at codes of conduct, but then codes of conduct do not replace or do not carry the same weight as, let us say, what we as the 1967 Outer Space Treaty or the other treaties that have been multilaterally negotiated and therefore carry the weight of international law. So from that point of view, these remain, but these remain the only building blocks that we have, because the other approaches in the Conference on Disarmament are at an impasse in terms of the proposal that has been put forward by Russia and China on placement of weapons, which is objected to, opposed by the US and other countries. And so therefore, no discussions on something like this have even taken place. The third thing is that why are we at an impasse? And I think it is important to understand it because of the fact that the world has changed hugely in a sense that the central principle that guided strategic stability during the Cold War was, in a sense, the focus on nuclear stability between the two superpowers. The reason is that the two superpowers, United States and Soviet Union, accounted for such a huge part of the global nuclear arsenals, more than 90%, that equation of nuclear stability between these two overwhelmed all other considerations and actually constituted the strategic stability equation which existed in the world. In a sense, this was achieved through, very early on, an acceptance of mutual vulnerability, right from the 60s, because the actual arms control processes began in the 1960s, but by that time, the notion of mutual vulnerability between the US and Soviet Union had been accepted by both sides. Today, the US continues to accept mutual vulnerability vis-a-vis Russia, certainly, in terms of, because both countries still carry the largest amount of nuclear arsenals. But the US no longer, or is unwilling, to accept the notion of vulnerability vis-a-vis any other country, whether it is China or whether it is North Korea, for that matter. Even though in actual practice, there may exist an equation of deterrence. And so therefore, some of these principles need to be rewritten on the basis of which you can actually begin arms control, disarmament, and these kind of negotiations. On what basis, what is the underlying principle of strategic stability, which we are going to have to identify, which is going to lead a number of players to find common advantage in actually sitting down and negotiating an outcome. The second thing is that we have also seen that we know exactly what is needed. We know what is needed is military restraint. We know what is needed is better traffic management in outer space. We know what is needed is a greater amount of space activity monitoring by preferably an international agency which can share this information. But we are unable to bring ourselves together in terms of nation states to be able to undertake this kind of negotiation. When the Cold War ended, there was a period during which the US, for the first time after the end of the Cold War, was no longer threatened existentially by any country's nuclear weapons. And it was a shift in US thinking. Post 9/11, there was another shift in thinking where global terrorism emerged as the new threat. And that became the primary threat. And now if you look at it, now with the recent national security strategy and the nuclear posture review, you find that interstate rivalry, interstate competition now becomes center stage and more important for the US compared to any other threat. And this then leads to certain other conclusions. So therefore, in a sense, what we are seeing is a complete shift back to major power politics, major power competition, but at the same time, lacking what I would call a strategic stability principle. And therefore, there is an element of not just, as was said about 5-6 years ago, that the space is now congested, contested, and competitive. I would add a fourth C to it, verging on confrontation. And that's where we are, and that is why we find it difficult, actually, to be able to move forward in terms of actually strengthening the existing global governance architectures, which are somewhat shaky because they were designed for different sets of players under different principles for a different technology. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So we get two complementary views. I think the more optimistic view with faith in the UN structures and possibilities that could emerge from there, and a more qualified approach to what the UN is doing and a focus on its limitations. I think both of these need to be open for discussion. Thank you very much, Ambassador Meyer and Ambassador Sood. Of course, my general response to what you said is to ask whether this is a problem of space diplomacy in particular, or is it a problem of diplomacy in general? Everything seems to be deadlocked. Climate change, WTO, CD, so is this really unique, or is it just a problem of diplomacy? So yes, exactly the point, which we can come back to later. So thank you very much. And we move to Federica Champa from the EU delegation in India, perhaps to get a bit of the regional view in terms of space governance.
So, good afternoon, everyone, dear moderator, fellow panelists, and dear participants. Allow me first to thank the organizers for arranging this very interesting conference in a crucial year for international space policy, as it marks the 50th anniversary of the first UN Space Conference. I'm here first to convey some greetings from my colleagues in Brussels. We have an EU envoy for space policy who couldn't join us today, and they've tasked me to deliver a statement on their behalf, as we value very much EU-India cooperation on space issues, and it was recently recognized that this can be strengthened when we held the EU-India summit here in Delhi in October 2017. So it's with this in mind that me as a generalist, I'm interacting with the forum of deep expertise. So ladies and gentlemen, I have a pleasure to do this with you today. So as already said in this conference, it cannot be underlined enough that space is a global common on which we increasingly rely, and that space technology and applications have great potential to help us realize the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. I don't know if that aspect was actually already highlighted. It's an important area of work for us. But as everybody has stressed already, space is increasingly competitive, contested, congested, and as there are so many actors, new actors, old actors, private actors, and so on, we do have a shared interest in building good governance around space and enhancing the sustainability of outer space activities. So we look at the upcoming Unispace at 50 meeting in June, which we think comes at a right and crucial watershed moment, to provide recommendations on a range of issues on the international space agenda, and to renew and strengthen the mandate of COPUOS and of UNOSA. So as a EU, we actively support, and we are already active in the preparatory process, as was mentioned, in a variety of fora, with a view to arriving at concrete deliverables on all the subjects on our agenda: space economy, space society, space accessibility, and space diplomacy. Now, turning to the main subject of this panel, may I first outline the EU positions generally on international space law, and all of this has to be seen in the context of our general support to multilateralism and, of course, global governance, or effective global governance. We are building very much on the existing legal framework that was already elaborated by previous speakers. And I do think, because it has already been spoken about, I would like to present to you why we believe that this framework, despite all the changes, the new actors, private actors, much more activity, much enhanced interest, increased production also of space activity and space debris, why this remains actually relevant for us to build on an international acquis. We still believe that the principles that informed the creation of space law and of international law in general remain very valid. I mean, I've already said space is a global common, and it requires global rules and cooperation. Seems obvious, but I guess nowadays even these aspects and principles are debated by some. We have also said often space is something we all share, we all have a common responsibility, and we think the world needs responsible space actors. I'm fully aware that everybody at the moment might be competing in space, thriving for autonomy and the innovative edge, but I also think that many actors have understood that they need to engage in international cooperation, given all the principles and all the problems that arise. Having said all that, we do continue to believe that the cornerstones of the system that is in place, the Committee on Peaceful Use of Outer Space and its subcommittees, for instance, that they continue to play an important role as a main forum for inclusive space dialogue, dialogue on space law and issues, and we care for this taking into account scientific and technical data, so sort of being up to date with current developments. We're looking forward to the space conference to refresh the mandates in order to allow them to meet the current challenges, because indeed there is so much more now that needs to be addressed. We moreover believe that development of guidelines of the long-term sustainability of outer space activities remain a key priority for everyone, notably with a view to enhancing safety of space operations. And then, as you know, one of the measures that the EU is very much supportive of, we believe in the crucial importance of enhanced notification of space-related activities and of the transparency and confidence-building measures. We think those provide a significant contribution to the security, safety, and sustainability of activities in outer space. So speaking of those things that we want to achieve, safety, security, sustainability, we continue, of course, to believe that the promotion of principles of responsible behavior in outer space in the framework of the UN and other multilateral fora is today more relevant than ever, and precisely given the multiplication of activities and of actors in outer space. So the EU and many space partners, and let me take that head on, it's always been talked about the EU Code of Conduct, but I may remind you that this is a broader international coalition that is carrying this work forward. We do believe that no matter how you name it, we think it is helpful to codify principles of responsible behavior in an international, non-legally binding instrument on outer space activities. And we strongly believe that such international instrument remains important, given at least the following factors. As already mentioned, the increasing use of and reliance on space, the need to mitigate the issue of space debris, which some and you're more expert than I am, consider already at a tipping point now and the risk of collision and so on. And also, of course, as was said before, no other agreement or soft law instrument covers such highly relevant substance in a comprehensive manner and up to date with the current state of play of also the technological development of today. We continue to think that it is important to negotiate such rules within the framework of the UN, also as a way to foster increased international cooperation. We think that these established standards of responsible behavior should be established across the full range of space activities. We can and must build on, but also develop further existing guidelines, for instance, the guidelines of the UN General Assembly on space debris mitigation. We should strengthen commitments on peaceful exploration and the use of outer space. And we should also help facilitate equitable access to outer space and increase transparency of the activities. So, turning to the space component of disarmament, we support the continuation of the work for the prevention of an arms race in outer space, PAROS, already referred to, which is critical for the UN disarmament and arms control agenda, and for the promotion of a shared understanding of the existing principles of global space governance, as a measure to prevent conflict and build international cooperation. So let me also react briefly, more on a personal basis, on the remarks that have been said by co-panelists, also perhaps to kick off the discussion. I think we are all totally seized by the current global strategic context. But for us, there is no choice in not continuing the work that needs to be done, given all the facts that we have already laid out. So I do think we proceed in parallel. We continue the work in part of very technical nature, while, of course, other channels need to address the larger questions of international cooperation and hopefully preserving a cooperative international multilateral environment overall. And secondly, I, as a lawyer, would totally concede that soft law, code of conduct, can never replace international law in a proper form. However, you also know diplomacy is an art of the possible, and today it's required to have a proactive and pragmatic diplomat with a sense of urgency. And if I may say again, out of my own substantive depth here, but I could perhaps point to the analogy of the climate change negotiations, which were stuck totally in 2009 and which managed to produce a productive result in 2015, also with some new players, emerging international leaders coming on board and being very constructive players. Perhaps we also just need to inject enough momentum, and you are very well placed to help us to do this in international negotiations. I think it's still possible, or let's not sort of give it up before everybody has tried, because the facts on why we need more international norms and more responsible behavior and pace, I think, have been clearly laid out and are very convincing. So turning quickly to the European Union or the European region as an actor in the space arena, let me just inform you that the EU and its member states together have the second largest budget for space in the world. And we have technology and expertise. The European Space Agency has already been mentioned, the EU Satellite Center. We also have major programs, Copernicus, Galileo, again, they were already mentioned. And just to highlight that the EU is already providing relevant navigation and communication services, and is also currently undertaking significant investment to ensure further build-up. I've said there's a new momentum for ambitious and innovation, while the EU remains a very cooperative partner, and a partner that often makes available the fruits of its work for international cooperation. If I can just close on an example where we have actually used new space-based technology for global tasks, and we think that disaster relief is part of this. You may know that when Hurricane Irma hit the Caribbean in August, September last year, the EU mobilized Copernicus in support of everybody in need. You might know that Copernicus is offering probably the best rapid mapping system in the world. And this means that in a matter of hours, actually, the EU could produce, or the system could produce accurate maps, both to assess damage and most importantly to help planning rescue operations, which in the end benefited both the European citizens surplus, but then of course the populations of those countries concerned. I think that's quite important, sort of also turning to these important results of new technologies and new developments, because they are benefiting mankind at large, or the sort of the globally. In closing, let me stress that we see ample room for enhanced space cooperation with India. We know that completing the LTS guidelines is a shared priority. We're also working bilaterally with India on enhancing cooperation on Earth observation, and I think it'll be very good to make progress in this year already. So thank you for attention, and thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much, and we move directly to Mr. Christensen.
Good afternoon, everyone. I believe I stand between this body and the pre-dinner break, so dive right into it. But I do want to thank the organizers, ORF, Rakesh, and her team, and also thank you, the members of the audience, for sticking with us through the day and for a very active, engaging discussion that I look forward to continuing this evening and tomorrow. So in the meantime, if we could get my slides up and running, that'd be fantastic. So yes, again, I'm Ian Christensen. I'm a project manager with the Secure World Foundation. As my colleague Victoria introduced us earlier this afternoon, we are a private operating foundation focused on cooperative solutions for space sustainability. So my focus within Secure World and within the space community is looking at private sector activities and the governance questions, challenges, and opportunities that the development in the private sector poses for the community writ large, and how we can collectively work on those challenges and opportunities. So here today, I'm here to talk a little bit about the change that we're seeing in the space sector, put some data behind that change, talk about the opportunities that poses for the evolution of the multilateral governance architecture, specifically looking at that through the lens of private industry. Ambassador Meyer, I think private industry is maybe not placed to be the prime contractor to support this process, but is certainly here to be a key subcontractor as we move forward. So find the clicker here. So yes, the changing nature of space activities. You've heard that reflected throughout this panel, throughout the theme of many of our remarks through this conference. And I think the question that we all want to ask ourselves, and we all need to ask ourselves, are we seeing a fundamental change in our community, in our sector right now, that is at its very heart redefining what we do, how we interact, and how we need to look at the policy, regulatory, and governance structure, both at the international and domestic level. This is open source data on this chart from the Union of Concerned Scientists, showing snapshots of the number of operational satellites in orbit over time at different points. So each of these data points is a particular date and the number of systems operating in orbit at that time. If you look 10 years ago, we're at about 800 satellites. Today, we're at about 1,800. So that trend line is a dramatic increase. And if we look at forecasts of what's coming, there's no evidence to say that dramatic increase will change, that it's a spike. It seems to be a continuing trend. So looking solely at the very small satellites, the nanosatellites, the CubeSats, forecasts of up to 2,500 of those to launch in the next 5 to 7 years. Beyond that, looking at the large mega constellations, the very large LEO constellations, based on US filings alone, that's 16,000 satellites. Now, not all of those will launch, but even if half of those launch, that's still a very fundamental change. So a key element of what we're seeing in this change is an increase in the number and diversity of the actors utilizing and operating in the space domain. Today, as referenced throughout the panel, we have a more complex, we have a more dynamic environment than when the fundamental principles of the international governance architecture were established. So let's go a little bit deeper into this fundamental change and see what interesting implications we can pull out and how we can think about how that might relate back to the governance questions before us today. So space is becoming more international. We had a very interesting panel at this conference just a few hours ago looking at emerging space actors and the nature of those programs and the emphasis of their policy development, the emphasis of their international cooperation. So starting, this data presents a percentage representation of the number of active satellites in orbit by country of ownership by decade. So starting from the 1950s certainly a two-country dynamic with the USSR at that time and the US. Moving towards today, we see a very diverse set of countries that are operating in the orbital environment. The count is somewhat ambiguous, but approximately 70 countries are operating their own satellite systems, either through governmental actors or through private sector actors. So this brings a number of interesting implications that have governance impact. We see more countries benefiting from space systems, space technology, space applications, and seeking to maximize that benefit in their interactions with the market and in their interactions with other countries. We see increased opportunities for partnership. We've heard that discussed several times today, and the diplomatic leverage and benefit that those partnerships potentially offer. And we see more voices from states and their representatives in the multilateral discussions, bringing new perspective, bringing new challenges, bringing new opportunity, but potentially contributing to the increasing complexity of those diplomatic discussions at the multilateral level. So that's change one. Space is becoming more international, more actors. Change number two, represented in that trend line, is space is becoming more commercial. Again, this is a snapshot of data based on percentage of operating satellites over the decades, this time cut by the sector of the operator. Again, starting from the 1950s, you primarily had two sectors operating. Those were government civil satellites and government military satellites. Moving towards the current day, you see a shift towards more commercial, more private sector actors, and a shift towards more amateur, academic, and other actors. So it's not simply a governmental domain any longer. We have an increasing commercial presence. And harkening back to the first chart I showed, that's not something that I believe and that many observers believe is going to change. It's going to become increasingly commercial, increasingly private sector as we move forward. The trend is in fact accelerating. So again, we have many interesting applications here. We've heard reference throughout today and several remarks of the transfer or the potential to transfer capabilities from government systems, government operators to the private sector, allowing governments to be more efficient with their resources and potentially invest in activities where there is no private sector incentive at this time. We see new applications emerging out of the private sector, things like on-orbit satellite servicing, things like space resources, space mining development, things like commercial space stations that don't have a clearly articulated place in the international governance framework right now. They are a need to develop domestic regulation to authorize and supervise those applications, and there's a need to think about them at a coordinated international level. We see a rapid pace of development, innovation, new benefit. And we see that as an increasingly commercially characterized domain, the role of best practices, guidelines, soft law, hard law even, developed solely in a governmental context may not be sufficient anymore. There's an increasing commercial character, and that commercial and private sector contribution to our community, to our space sector, has a greater influence on defining and enforcing responsible behavior than it has in the past. So this increasing dynamic, this commercial character is something that the multilateral governance architecture is faced with evolution to account for today. So very quickly, to just summarize that, commercial development, private sector development, new actors pose a number of opportunities for the community, including lower cost of access, lower technical and scientific barriers, broadening and diversity of actors and uses, new applications, new services, new benefit, and increased access to that benefit. At the same time, it's posing us challenges: regulatory fit, efficiency, scale, and the proper context for domestic and international governance approaches for new commercial applications. Few standards for operations, few standards for practices in a purely private sector sense, and we've heard several references throughout the event to the space debris, space situational awareness, and potential spectrum challenges posed by a increasingly diverse and increasingly large set of actors. So the complexity of the domain and the pace of change no longer reflects the context fully of what the international governance system was designed to. Yet we still have to recognize that the principles inherent in the Outer Space Treaty and the subsequent development are what enabled this development we're seeing, what enabled the innovation and the new applications. So the continued evolution to continue to see those benefits is important. And with the remainder of the time that I have here today, I want to just discuss some ongoing initiatives within the private sector that can contribute to the evolution of the multilateral governance structure, and to discuss and challenge us to think about how governments and the private sector can work together to ensure the continued efficacy of that multilateral governance structure. We've heard references to norms of behavior. I don't think I need to belabor this discussion further with a definition of what a norm is. We all have an inherent sense. Oops, there we go. We have an inherent sense of what norms are. It's the common understanding of practice that we all recognize and guide our behavior. We heard from Marco and we heard from others that norms are a key feature of the space governance architecture today. A key trend that we see in the private sector world is the emergence of private sector-driven efforts to define norms of behavior and private and responsible principles focused solely or in part on commercial operations in consultation with government. The impetus for doing that refers back to, we heard the congested, competitive, and contested language. I would change contested to invested. So there's an economic incentive, a business and market incentive for private sector entities to be interested in protecting the sustainability of the domain and ensuring that there's a common understanding within competitors, within the market, of what responsible behavior is. There's a business reason to have that environment remain stable, to have that environment remain secure, and that is contributing to the efforts that we see to develop private sector principles, norms of behavior, focus on responsible practices. Those principles are undergoing in several different areas of activity. So I want to just highlight a couple of them and then talk very briefly about how they relate back to the multilateral institutions that we've referenced early. Mega constellations, large constellations. Several different trade associations in the US and internationally are working on developing consensus statements on principles of operations for those large constellations, covering things like constellation separation, debris mitigation principles, satellite interference communication. Those principles are being developed at an industry-to-industry level in consultation with government and with an eye towards contributing that to conversation at events such as Unispace Plus 50, such as through representation to delegates, through delegations at COPUOS and other forums. Secure World Foundation, my organization, is involved in a couple of different efforts focused on some of the new commercial applications. On-orbit satellite servicing, we are part of a team initially funded through the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency in the US, or DARPA, to develop consensus voluntary standards for on-orbit servicing and rendezvous and proximity operations. Again, so how can an industry, a private sector-driven activity, provide that confidence in its applications and that transparency in what it's doing to ensure that responsible principles are defined? Space resources, space mining. Secure Worlds Foundation is a partner in the Hague Space Resources Governance Working Group, which has defined, which is a track 1.5 dialogue composed of academia, industry, and several government representatives looking to define a set of building blocks that the multilateral system can take into account as it attempts to define domestic and international legal and policy frameworks for the space mining industry and the development of potential space mining activities. Initiatives like this pose a number of questions. How do non-governmental forums translate, and non-governmental forums, industry-driven forums, translate into formal policy action at the domestic and international level? In what ways do existing governmental forums adapt to private sector activities? COPUOS, for example, was not designed to take direct input from the private sector. It has to come through the delegations. What are the verification and operational impact of consensus best practices? So industry, the private sector can define operational best practices, but how do they verify and enforce those best practices? What industry-developed norms and best practices are codified into hard law or even soft law instruments at the international level? I don't have to pretend to have the answers to these questions. I can't speak from my experience with the Hague Space Resources Governance Group, but a key lesson that I've taken away from that is a key element of these processes is the exchange of information, the building of relationships between private sector operators and governmental and multilateral forum, and building of connections that don't necessarily naturally exist. This can serve an important function as a confidence and transparency building measure that may contribute to the renovation that we discussed earlier in the panel. And so with that, I will close my remarks. Thank you as the audience. Thank my fellow panelists. I hope we have some time for discussion here.
Thank you. So thank you both of the later speakers. Frederica, it was very interesting. I'm just jumping in with an immediate reaction to what you said. One is, of course, you did bring the Agenda 2030 on board, which is interesting to see whether it comprehensively addresses issues of outer space at all. But the other is just a comment which also ties into my comment on diplomacy in general, which is you mentioned the climate change as a comparative sort of example, the Paris Agreement in particular. But as I see it, a big shift in principles did take place before the Paris Agreement was agreed upon. So is that the kind of change that would be required in order to come to some sort of an agreement on a renovation of the space architecture? Is perhaps what we may need to think about. And thank you also very much to bring in the private actors, very important. Of course, the Outer Space Treaty does say that states are all responsible ultimately for the actions of the private, so I imagine there is a very close coordination. I wonder if there are some institutional outlets as well for private actors to in some way engage with or contribute to norm building, speak to the states, since the close relationship is codified in the treaty itself. But let's not limit it to that. May I be partial and first ask the panelists if they have questions for each other before I open the floor? Right, so then I already see hands from the floor. Could I start from here, please? Yes, ma'am.
I'm Dr. Malti Goyal. I want to ask Ambassador Rakesh Sood about the way you said that we have to change the guidelines with the changing actors, changing players. This was kind of a multilateral governance you will have in mind when we talk of South Asia satellite, which India launched about 8 months back. So was there some kind of a guidelines would you recommend for its
Thank you very much.
Operation?
Yeah. Could we take a bunch of questions and then come back?
Okay. Quick questions for Ambassadors Meyer and Sood. Ian presented a lot of great information about the private sector, but states have often, particularly on security issues, been reluctant to be influenced by industry. How do you see the private sector being able to potentially influence, or are there any ways that the private sector might be able to influence governments towards coming to new agreements on responsible behavior in outer space? And what might need to shift in order for the private sector to have a greater voice in venues like the CD?
First of all, I'd like to thank the panel for an engaging session. My question is basically related to accountability, and I'm posing it to Mr. Ian, and the question is that you talked about the exchange of information and ideas and how it is the bedrock towards building a global governance structure in governing outer space exploration and mining and other commercial activities. How does a multilateral institution basically ascertain or maintain a check on the credibility and the sanctity, the truthfulness of the information that's being passed on to them by the commercial actors? Thank you.
And we just have this one round, so please.
My question is for Ambassador Sood. I am sympathetic to the idea of wanting to have a legally binding restriction on whatever you think one thinks is threatening to the stability of the space domain. But when I look at things like the LTS guidelines, the long-term sustainability guidelines, in COPUOS, which have been debated and argued over for 8 years, and we might finish something, and these are non-legally binding. I'm just wondering how one can make an argument for a legally binding response that will be able to keep up with the technology and not get outpaced by current events. Thank you.
Thank you. Any other questions? Yes.
Hi, I think the speakers touched upon the impasse or the stalemate within the CD, but I want to ask both, especially Paul Meyer and maybe Ambassador Sood also can answer, as to how do you get over this impasse that has been characteristic for more than 2 decades? Are there alternate platforms that you can think of, or other ways of dealing with it? How do you, because you have to, given the kind of challenges that we face, you do have to find different ways of dealing with it. So if you have any thoughts on this, thank you.
Well, thank you. We'll close the question round and back to the panelists. I'm sorry for bunching all the questions together, but you're free to pick and choose the ones you would like to speak on. Could we start with Ambassador Meyer then?
Just let me, in terms of Raji's question, I think it is important because of this impasse, as you note, is protracted. But I think diplomacy, if it's serious about its objectives, finds a way to accomplish them. And in the international community, what that has boiled down to is not allowing consensus procedures to stymie the interests of the majority of participating states. Fortunately, we have an alternative majority voting convening authority in the General Assembly. And the only progress, significant progress that has been made in recent years on arms control and disarmament treaties and conventions have been through using General Assembly authorization. The Arms Trade Treaty it comes to mind, as well as, of course, the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, both of which came about through the General Assembly. And if I can riff just a little farther, this UN GGE that has been established, in my mind, is a recognition belatedly by the main sponsors of the PPWT that they were never going to get that draft treaty considered in the CD, given its deadlock. And so they've used the General Assembly created vehicle to at least have the issue of legally binding constraints on outer space activity examined and discussed. So that, in my opinion, is how one can make progress in the current situation.
Any other questions?
I think I focused on that. I mean, on the private sector, I think money counts and speaks. I can't believe that industry that is so active in lobbying on any other area is going to be passive if states begin to act in a way that's going to completely ruin their business model. And you'll find that politicians tend to be receptive when private sector organizes itself on these matters. And I think one hopes the deteriorating geopolitical situation may be exactly the stimulus that the industry needs to begin some remedial action.
Thank you, Ambassador Sood.
That's my cue to pick up the private sector question. So to the gentleman's question about how does a multilateral institution trust and verify the information that the private sector provides? It's a good question. It's a complicated question, right? Because the relationships are not necessarily direct relationships, right? Relating back to what our moderator said kind of in the wrap-up remarks about states' responsibility for their national persons. So in general, the reporting pathway goes, right? I'm a private sector operator from the US. I talk to my national delegation. They talk to the multilateral forum, right? To evolve that process, what we've learned through the Hague Space Resources Governance Working Group is we took a set of parties that were all interested in an issue, but did not necessarily operate in the same spheres of influence. So we had academic institutions, we had diplomatic institutions, and we had private sector. And over a several-year process, we built relationships between those in an informal process, right? Not a formal part of the multilateral system, but we built these relationships. And I think that's one way you do it. You just have to bring those parties to the point where they can interact with each other in more informal ways. And I think there's need for education from both directions in that I think parts of the private sector don't necessarily understand the role of the multilateral institutions, and I think that there are part of the multilateral institutions that may not be fully aware of the investment and activity going on within parts of the private sector. So it's not a specific answer, but I think it's just finding those stovepipe communities and looking for as many informal ways to build connections between them.
Well, I think Paul answered to an extent the question about the CD that Raji you posed. The fact is that the CD has actually lost legitimacy. I mean, first of all, we need to accept. If we don't identify a problem, then I'm afraid we will not be able to find a solution to that problem. If you don't identify the illness, then you can't prescribe the right medication for it. So the fact is that the CD has lost legitimacy. It is not as if the CD was at an impasse, that it had not been earlier in its incarnations, had it not sort of been stuck, as it were, at an impasse because of global politics. But now there is a slight difference. It is global politics and also the erosion of legitimacy. And the erosion of legitimacy, it's ironical in a sense that, according to me, the basic flaw arose because the CD works by consensus, and consensus was a rule that was always observed. But in 1996, when the CTBT negotiations were on, many of the countries decided to bypass the consensus rule, use the General Assembly, and thereby introduce the CTBT text. Now, that was the key which began the process of erosion, and ironically, many other countries picked up that trick, and which is how the Ban Convention was done, and which is why it was not done in the CD. And therefore, in my view, I think the CD has lost legitimacy, and therefore I'm very skeptical that we will see a revival of the CD. So we will have to find separate platforms for separate negotiations, and we'll have to devise new rules of procedure. And that may sound like a bleak prediction, but that's how it is going to be. If you look at legally binding versus norm building, you're right. I mean, but legally binding has the advantage of taking a broad approach, and which is why, let's say, Paul also referred to when he said that the Outer Space Treaty is a cornerstone of space governance architecture. It is because it is legally binding, and because when it says that the rules of the UN Charter apply, it makes it, it reinforces, as it were, that particular provision. But whether it is legally binding mechanisms or whether it is norm building, I'm not saying that norm building does not have a role. All I'm saying is that neither can take place in a political vacuum. Even norm building has to take place with, as you said, a prime contractor. So, but right now what you perceive is a political vacuum, which is why even norm building initiatives tend to falter and do not attract the same kind of traction as they perhaps ought to. And maybe, and I found some of the slides that Ian showed interesting because, you know, if you saw in the 60s and 70s from that particular slide, all satellites were government satellites, whether civil satellites or military satellites, but they were entirely government. And actually, those were the decades when you got into place some elements of the space governance architecture. So today, in that particular slide, if you notice, the last bar actually had just about 50% of satellites coming from government. But the other 50% were coming from non-government, whether academics or other research institutions or commercial and so on. So if that weight continues to grow, now however that weight is not the fact that it was 50 government and 50 outside government, that may be true, let's say, of the United States, but certainly not true of India or China or many other spacefaring countries. And so therefore, if you analyze that or if you parse that further, you find that because of the gap in that thing, you find less of attraction or an ability to develop widely adhered to or norms which are able to attract global adherence. And I think that will have to change somewhat before we can get into those guidelines, before we can get into norms and how they will come about. But certainly that will be one of the drivers of the change. And finally, in terms of how do we evolve multilateral guidelines, I mean, again, it is, according to me, it is a question of political will. I mean, we saw in SAARC, we couldn't name it SAARC satellite because there was one country, Pakistan, which was not willing to take part in it. But it wasn't enough that it was not willing to take part in it, but it also exercised a veto about the naming of the satellite and refused to call it a SAARC satellite. So I think this indicates that when we are talking of interstate discussions, negotiations, whatever, it is ultimately politics that will hold the key and that will drive the process. It can't be but otherwise.
Thank you. Right, so let me thank the panelists. I already have an indication to wrap up. As has already been said by several of the speakers here, the Outer Space Treaty is at the core of space governance. And at the core of the treaty is the first article, which says that the use and exploration of outer space shall be the province of all mankind. Now, what has come out clearly is that the nature and intensity of the use and exploration has changed in these 50 years. And also, all mankind, what that defines has also changed from the key players to new players like private actors and also the emerging players we saw in the last panel. So these are all going to be perhaps up on the table, maybe at the Unispace 50 conference that you mentioned in June this year, and we look forward to that. But I think, in a sense, both the optimistic and the pessimistic views did indicate that certainly change is needed as far as the governance structure is concerned. All of these governance structures are created in the 60s and 70s and do need a relook. So with that, let me thank once again the panelists, and thank you very much for this spectrum of views.